Some decisions in famous families do not need a press release to shake the world. They happen quietly, behind closed doors, without explanation, and somehow that silence says more than any headline ever could. When Maddox quietly stopped carrying Brad Pitt's last name, there was no explosive interview, no public accusation, no dramatic confrontation, just a private decision that carried the weight of something far bigger than paperwork. Because in Hollywood, a name like Pitt is not just personal, it is legacy, access, and power. Walking away from it is never casual, and that is why the choice felt so unsettling. It raised a harder question than gossip ever could. What has to break inside a family before a son decides that even the name tying him to his father no longer feels like his own? From the outside, the Jolie-Pitt family once looked untouchable, almost mythic. They were more than a celebrity couple. They were a global symbol of beauty, fame, influence, and purpose. And at the center of that image, from the very beginning, was Maddox. Before the distance, before the silence, before the family became a story of fracture, Maddox stood at the center of something the world viewed as extraordinary. In many ways, he was the beginning of the image that came to define them. Over time, that image grew into something larger than a family. It became a symbol of a beautiful, multicultural, internationally admired household that seemed to represent love, purpose, and modern celebrity at its most meaningful. Maddox grew up inside that symbol. He appeared in photographs, on red carpets, during international travel, and beside the moments that helped build the Jolie-Pitt myth. From the outside, it looked like a life filled with privilege and rare opportunity. But children do not grow up inside public narratives. They grow up inside rooms, routines, tones of voice, and the emotional weather of the people raising them. That is where the real story always lives. And for a child at the center of such a carefully watched family, the gap between image and atmosphere can become impossible to ignore.
Families like this rarely fall apart all at once, especially in public. Collapse almost never begins with one visible moment. It begins in smaller ways, the kind outsiders cannot measure, but children feel immediately. A shift in tone, a change in routine, tension that lingers after conversations end, schedules that stop flowing together the way they once did. In a family built under constant attention, even ordinary strain becomes heavier because nothing is allowed to unravel in private for long. For Maddox, this was not just about witnessing a relationship under stress, it was about growing up inside a home where the emotional atmosphere may have become harder to trust, while the public image still demanded control, grace, and unity. That contradiction can shape a child in lasting ways. From the outside, the Jolie-Pitt family still carried the language of strength and purpose, but inside any family, image means very little once daily life begins to feel uncertain. Children notice when warmth turns into caution. They notice when conversations become guarded. They notice when presence becomes inconsistent, even before anyone explains what is happening. And the older they are, the more clearly they understand that something important is changing. For Maddox, that may have been the real beginning of the break. Not one dramatic incident, but the slow realization that the family identity the world admired no longer matched the emotional reality he was living inside. There comes a point in some families when a child stops trying to understand who is right and who is wrong. The question becomes much simpler and much more painful. Who feels safe and who does not? By the time family conflict reaches a certain level, children are no longer listening to explanations the way adults think they are. They are watching for tone, for unpredictability, for the feeling that something inside the home is no longer steady. And once that feeling sets in, attachment can change in ways that are difficult to reverse. For an older child, especially one old enough to read tension before it is spoken aloud, the emotional shift can happen quickly. The parent who once felt larger than life can begin to feel distant. The bond that once seemed permanent can start to feel conditional. And when trust becomes unstable, closeness no longer feels natural, it begins to feel risky. This is often the hidden turning point in fractured families. The child is no longer waiting for the adults to restore normalcy. Instead, he begins protecting himself from further disappointment, confusion, and emotional harm. That is not rebellion, that is adaptation. And once someone reaches that stage, distance does not feel cruel, it feels necessary. For Maddox, the deepest break may not have been the moment the world noticed trouble. It may have been the moment he no longer experienced family loyalty as security.
A last name is never just a last name, especially when it belongs to one of the most famous families in the world. In ordinary life, the surname can represent history, belonging, and connection. In Hollywood, it carries even more. It can open doors before a person ever speaks. It can offer protection, status, and inherited relevance. And that is what makes Maddox's decision so significant. Walking away from the name Pitt was not a small, emotional gesture. It meant stepping away from a symbol tied not only to his father, but to power itself. That kind of choice is rarely impulsive. It usually comes after a long internal process, when the meaning of the name begins to feel heavier than the value it offers. Because a name does not only connect a person to legacy, it also connects them to memory. And when those memories no longer feel safe, the name itself can begin to feel like something carried rather than something chosen. In that sense, dropping the surname was not simply rejection, it was definition. It was a quiet way of saying that identity could no longer remain attached to a version of family that no longer felt emotionally secure. That is why this decision should not be mistaken for immaturity or revenge. Rebellion is loud. This was not loud. Rebellion wants to provoke. This did not ask for attention. What Maddox appeared to do was something far more serious. He drew a boundary. He separated who he was becoming from a legacy that no longer reflected the emotional truth of his life. What makes this story so powerful is not just the decision itself, but the way it was made. There was no public campaign behind it, no interview designed to embarrass anyone, no dramatic statement, just silence and then a choice. And in families shaped by imbalance, silence can become its own form of control. It can be the only way a person takes back ownership of a story that was too often told around them instead of by them. By the time a name is quietly removed, the emotional separation has usually existed much longer than the public realizes. The paperwork is simply the visible ending to an invisible process that has already run its course. And maybe that is the saddest truth inside stories like this. Healing does not always look like reunion. It does not always come with forgiveness, photographs, or a return to what once was. Sometimes healing looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like choosing peace over legacy, boundaries over performance, and self-protection over symbolism. In Hollywood, walking away from a famous name can seem shocking, even ungrateful. But from another angle, it can be the clearest sign that a person has stopped living inside someone else's image and finally chosen to live inside their own truth. And perhaps that is what makes Maddox's quiet decisions so unforgettable. He did not need to publicly reject his father for the world to understand that something had ended. He only needed to stop carrying a name that no longer felt like home.